Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Sharon Stein. I'm an associate professor and professor of climate complexity and coloniality in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia. And I'm going to talk today about how we can talk about AI in times of planetary transitions. And I'm making this recording as part of an effort to connect with others who are also grappling with the risks, complexities, and possibilities of AI in this era of transitions. People who want to think both critically and with curiosity about what this moment is and what it's asking of us. So if this kind of inquiry resonates with you, I welcome you to be in touch. You'll find a link at the end of the talk where you can connect and sign up for updates, including a virtual conversation series hosted by my professorship on this theme, which will be launching in the 2026-2027 school year. So I want to start by acknowledging that my home institution, the University of British Columbia, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. But currently I am located in what is currently known as London, Ontario, for my sabbatical year, on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wook, and Conneauton nations. Also acknowledging three nearby First Nations, the Chippewa of the Thames, Oneida of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. And I generally start these acknowledgements when I'm talking in my role as a professor in particular, acknowledging that the lands where our universities sit have been home to forms of knowledge, learning, and relationships that long predate our universities and will likely survive longer than our universities might. And in many ways, this acknowledgement is foundational to what's going to follow, because like our universities, AI is not immaterial. It requires mineral, water, energy, and it is also made up of human knowledge and data, most of it scraped without consent, just like much of the knowledge that has been taken in many cases from communities and housed in our universities. And so the question I always invite myself and others to consider when doing a land acknowledgement is, what are the responsibilities that actually follow from this recognition so that it becomes more than tokenism and actually becomes part of our orienting commitments as scholars, as educators, and as people. I also wanted to share a little bit about my own trajectory of how I came to this work in AI for context. So I am a white settler researcher of education. I have been studying for a long time sort of three main areas of inquiry: the politics of knowledge, the enduring impacts of colonialism in settler societies and institutions, and the cultural drivers of social and ecological breakdown. Which means that in many ways, I have been training to study AI for years without realizing it. So until ChatGPT arrived in our institutions in late 2022, I didn't know that I was going to be a researcher of AI. But particularly by 2023, 2024, I began following developments in AI more closely, not only in education, but I had, an anxiety about jumping into the fray. I was still figuring out how I wanted to approach the topic, still making sense of the wider social, political, and ecological impacts. And I could see and sense how divisive of a topic it was becoming. So I stayed quiet for a while, allowing myself to just be in that inquiry and remain curious. But increasingly, I began to notice the negative impacts of AI's arrival on relationships in our universities, between students and professors, between professors and professors, between students and students, sort of an air of suspicion and deep uncertainty. And so I decided to enter the conversation not because I had anything figured out, but because I had a deep concern that the usual ways we were going about addressing this subject were negatively impacting our relationships. And so one of the entry points for me of doing so is situating it in relation to my other work. So situating AI, in particular generative AI's arrival, within this broader context of planetary transitions. So I approach AI as a symptom and an amplifier of these transitions, not their root cause, and also leave open the possibility that certain kinds of relationally attuned and earth-aligned AI could help us navigate these transitions as well. Very much inspired by my former colleague, Dr. Vanessa Andreotti, and her work on meta-relational AI. But recognizing that ultimately how these planetary transitions unfold and the role of AI in them is deeply contested and requires further collective and careful inquiry. So the inquiry that I'm sort of sharing with you and inviting you into today is one that tries to shift the conversation about AI as a discrete and isolated and exceptional form or source of inequality and unsustainability to seeing AI as kind of an accelerant and a mirror of existing unsustainable and inequitable systems. AI certainly makes familiar problems worse. You know, it reveals the fragility also, though, of the industrial model of society that sort of gave birth to AI, and therefore also opens up new possibilities for critiquing and reimagining. So there are sort of three parts to this inquiry. One is widening the frame of the way we approach AI, so expanding our problem space essentially, beyond just documenting the harms of AI and beyond also proposing fixes, to also ask what is AI revealing about the deeper systems into which it is arriving. The sort of second dimension is trying to find ways to depolarize how we talk together about AI. Trying to trace how different communities and institutions are navigating and negotiating AI in practice, and trying to find ways that we can sit with this technology and everything that it brings us with people that we disagree with, without demanding consensus and actually being able to hear each other, even when it's uncomfortable. And then finally, trying to ensure that there are spaces where we can pluralize whose epistemologies, priorities, and worldviews actually shape AI. So supporting community-directed experiments with AI that are exploring different ways of designing and governing it. So essentially, this inquiry assumes that many of the conversations we have about AI are not really just about AI. They're about many other things, and we want to make those things visible so that we can, again, widen that frame of inquiry, in particular around questions of inequality and unsustainability. And this inquiry is funded by my current SSHRC Insight Grant and my current UBC Killam Faculty Research Fellowship that's funding my sabbatical. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. Now, I want us to think about the terrain that we're in as we start to dive into the complexities of AI in this moment. So I have two quotes here that I would like to sort of orient what I present today. And it's no coincidence that these are Indigenous thinkers who are inviting us to think both critically and also differently about AI. There is no single correct narrative about what AI is or what it should become, but who we listen to when we're thinking about these things matters, right? And this goes back to the question of the politics of knowledge. So the first quote we have is from Sam DeShields, who's a Chickasaw researcher. I've seen them speak in several online presentations about AI, and they had this quote that really stuck with me. You can't opt out of AI. AI is here, it's surrounding us, and it's using the data that's already out there. Data gathering is already happening globally without consent. AI is happening around you and to you. The question is how you engage and under what governance. And then I have a quote here from Dr. Jason Lewis, who is the PI of the Indigenous-led Abundant Intelligences Project, which is an incredible research project that I encourage you to look into if you're not already aware of it. But one of the things he says is that although AI developers might assume they're building a product or a tool, this sort of abstract, neutral, objective thing, they're actually building a relationship to which they should attend. And this is sort of one of the insights he shares and says, when we actually consider AI from different knowledge systems, in particular from indigenous knowledge systems, we ask different questions of AI, of its designers, and what we want to be and how we want to relate to it. So I invite us to approach our inquiry with these sort of inspiring quotes in mind, to think about how AI is already around us all the time and how we then want to relate to it, instead of assuming we can simply opt out, but actually asking, what is this thing that's already here, whether we like it or not. So the invitation essentially of what I'm offering today is sort of, I say 3 C's of collective inquiry. The first is curiosity. So curiosity, bringing your curiosity about what AI is and what else it could become, and what it means for us and who we are becoming as well. And this will require then bracketing the desire for certainty. Is AI good or bad? In order to be curious, we have to hold that open. Even as we might have critiques and concerns, that's all welcome, but try to avoid the impulse to have a certain answer, even if just for, the next little while in this presentation. But this is also accompanied by critical discernment. So attending to the many harms, the real and the potential harms of AI alongside its precarious possibilities, acknowledging our own complicity in the harms that it may bring, and asking what responsibility looks like in ethically and materially constrained contexts like the present. And then finally, compassion. So having compassion, having empathy toward ourselves and others as we navigate these complex matters in complex times. No one is outside of complicity in the systems we're going to be sort of touching on, but we can approach accountability as a relational practice and the possibility for repair. So this is the sort of itinerary of what I'm going to present after this introduction. I'm going to invite us to engage with the BUS methodology, which comes out of the work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, who I was part of when we were active for the last 10 years. I'm going to introduce a resource that is in a draft form, Staying with the Trouble of AI in Higher Education, and review some of that and invite you to dive in further on your own time. I'm going to do a little check-in to see how your BUS is doing, and you'll know what that means a little bit more in a moment. I'm going to then talk about 3 layers of this inquiry about AI, inequality, and unsustainability. Think a little bit about what Earth-aligned AI might look like and mean, and then do a BUS checkout. So the BUS methodology is a methodology that was developed by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, led by Dr. Vanessa Andreotti. And it's essentially a methodology for making space for the complexity, the plurality, the contradictions within ourselves and each other and the world. And the basic idea is that we all have a range of perspectives, ideas, and emotions within us. So we say we have many different bus passengers within us in this metaphor. We have people at the front of the bus who we're probably more familiar with and who may often be the drivers taking turns. There's people in the middle of the bus who we may know a little bit about and may come out in certain, maybe even predictable moments. And then some people in the back of the bus that we're not as familiar with. We might not even be aware that they're there. We might be repressing them. And only when something activates them do they make themselves visible. So the invitation is to kind of become more familiar and intimate with our own internal buses, making it available to ourselves to hold that contradiction and complexity so that we can hold the contradiction and complexity of others. Again, balancing, that curiosity, that critical discernment, and compassion. So I'm going to invite you to try and observe your own internal bus as I proceed with the rest of this talk and see, what the different passengers are saying, thinking, and feeling, maybe what the conversation is like between them, maybe what the landscape is, right? Is it really rocky? Is there fog outside of the bus? Do you have a flat tire? So try and sort of attend to what's happening on your bus as we go forward, and we'll do some sort of structured check-ins for you to pause as well. So we're going to start with the Staying with the Trouble of AI in Higher Education resource, which is in draft form, and your feedback is welcome. I just wanted to introduce it by saying that the inspiration for the title comes, of course, from Donna Haraway's work about staying with the trouble, and then the format of the resource is also inspired by Dr. Andreotti's Clearing the Field series framework. But essentially, it is an effort to try and offer some space for us to unpack what's happening with AI in higher education without reproducing the same polarized debates. It's very difficult to have discerning, accountable, collective conversations about AI when we're so polarized, but actually we need these conversations more than ever. So the sort of orienting intention of the resource is to, one, try and disarm this impulse to seek certainty so that we can remain curious and compassionate, and to create a container for actually practicing curiosity, critical discernment, and compassion when it comes to AI, but also in other contexts in our various institutions. So just as a brief overview of the resource itself, and if you use the QR code, you can access the draft here. There's 6 chapters. The first chapter is about affect, how we feel about AI. The second is about knowledge, what we know about AI and how we think we know. 3 is about temporality, sort of where we are situating ourselves within a longer timeline in relation to AI's arrival in higher education. 4 is about equity. How does AI intersect with systemic injustices? 5 is about literacy. What matters beyond this very narrow technical literacy about AI, different kinds of AI literacy and different kinds of literacy in general. And then 6 is a sort of strategy, like what do we want to do about this? What feels possible and desirable in this moment? So as we move through the chapters briefly, we're going to focus on chapter 1 and 2. I encourage you to try to notice at least 3 different passengers on your bus. What are they thinking, feeling, and saying? And maybe what is that conversation like between them? So the first chapter is about affect, or sometimes emotion. They're not exactly the same thing, but that word's more familiar. You can use that. The idea is that, we have a lot of conversations about AI. We might read a lot about AI, but we don't often take the time to sort of check how we're feeling about AI, which sometimes is actually what's driving a lot of our responses. So trying to see what's under there, what's happening on the bus. So in this section, we invite people to think about how you feel when you think about AI. What are the sensations that come for you, and how strong are they? So that you might be feeling fear, anxiety, overwhelm, confusion, grief, relief, curiosity, excitement, annoyance, anger, dread, resignation, and probably other things that aren't on here. So if you want, I invite you to pause the video and actually go through and see, how you're feeling in relation to each of these. Maybe you have 0 fear, or maybe your fear's at a 5. And try and see, kind of map where you are. And understanding that this is not static, right? In this moment, you might feel one way, but tomorrow in a meeting about AI, you might have a different sensation, right? It's not a static thing. Our buses are always moving and changing. So the second sort of dimension of the affective layer of AI in our institutions is, maybe we feel differently about different kinds of AI, because we know that AI is not a monolithic thing, although we often talk about it like it is, and I'm not going to go into a detailed discussion about what is AI and what isn't it and what different kinds of AI there are. I do want us to briefly take a moment to think about the fact that we might have different feelings about different kinds of AI. So, for instance, corporate AI, big tech, which is often the focus of a lot of the research and the critique, and often the thing that many of us who do use AI engage with, at least sometimes, that might be very different than the way we feel about justice-oriented AI. There are AI platforms like Thaura, which is created by Syrian engineers who are particularly concerned about ensuring that responses relating to Palestine were fair to the Palestinian people. There's, of course, abundant intelligences, which I mentioned at the beginning. There are many different kinds of AI, even though that first one on the list tends to be dominant. There's also medical AI, which is not usually, generative AI might have that dimension, but it's more about diagnosing, for instance, cancer in a screening. There's also AI for quote unquote decoding animal communication, and we might have questions about what that means, but that might be different again than how we feel about corporate AI. And those are just a few examples, even on this list. There's many different other kinds of AI, ways of parsing AI, but just a reminder that we might not have the same, feeling about these different approaches to AI across the board. So that's a little preview of that chapter 1. Now we're going to move to chapter 3. Again, I'm not going in full detail. You can reference the resource at any time. But chapter 3 is about the question of temporality, or when we are in time, and how AI's arrival relates to that temporality. So there's 3 sort of different dimensions that I unpack here, and that is 1, AI and the specific challenges facing higher education right now, AI within the longer arc of higher education history, and AI within a broader temporality of the present. What kind of moment are we in? So if we start with AI and the specific challenges facing higher education, in the resource there's about 10 challenges facing higher education. This is just a selection, but we've got ecological collapse, so climate and biodiversity collapse looming over the future while our institutions struggle to respond at the scale that's required. Social polarization, so higher education being positioned within broader cultural divides, making our campuses flashpoints for debate, protest, and political scrutiny. And then mental health pressures, so students and faculty and staff facing these mental health challenges, often exacerbated by under-resourcing of mental health services and increased social isolation. So I invite you to pick one of these 3 challenges, or if you have the resource in front of you, pick one of the other 10, and consider, did AI cause this challenge? Is AI making this challenge more visible? Is it accelerating this challenge or alleviating it, or potentially both? And then what is my relationship to this challenge? How is it affecting me, but how might I also be contributing to the problem? The second layer is situating AI within a longer arc of higher education history. So thinking about how your bus resonates with each of the following statements. So if it helps to close your eyes, you're welcome to do so. Higher education is fundamentally sound, and AI offers new tools to enhance learning efficiency and competitiveness. Another statement, higher education was better before AI. We need to protect what works and resist disruptions that threaten the future of our institutions. AI did not cause the current crisis of higher education, but it is deepening it by undermining trust, academic integrity, and the role of educators. Another statement, higher education has always carried unsustainable and harmful logics. AI just makes this more visible. It's a symptom of harm, not the source. And then finally, AI could open other possibilities if engaged with care, equity, and ecological imagination. So again, remember that you don't need to pick one of these statements. It might be that you have passengers that resonate with each of these, and you might have passengers that resist each of these. So even if it feels contradictory, we might be sensing these things all at once. And certainly we might notice all of these and more patterns within our institutional context and the conversations we're having about AI. So finally is this question about the broader temporality of the present, which gets more to this notion of planetary transitions. And that is that we are facing challenges in many different realms of our lives. There's the social, right, polarization, the collapse of shared truths, of social isolation. There's the geopolitical impacts, right, the democratic backsliding, institutional distrust, illegal invasions and threats. The economic impacts of rising inequality, economic precarity, And right now, extractive global supply chains that have actually been interrupted, which makes them more visible, our reliance on them more visible, but also puts many people in a very difficult situation. The ecological impacts, I don't think I need to elaborate these too much. They're very visible to most of us at this point. Epistemological dimension, so the fracturing of shared frames of reference and even reality. And then the psychological, challenges, collective grief that many of us are experiencing in relation to all of these and more without capacities for metabolizing them, especially collectively. So anxiety, dissociation, and other impacts of trying to just live our lives in this very difficult moment. So one of the things I want to spend a little bit of time on is situating this present moment within a couple different possible frames. And one that is very familiar is framing the present as a crisis, or perhaps a polycrisis, or a permacrisis, or a metacrisis, but that word crisis sort of being at the center. And one of the things I want us to do is consider what the crisis framing allows and what it forecloses or makes sort of invisible. And this is a framing that is inspired by Dr. Kyle White's work about crisis epistemology, as well as some work done by the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, in which we tried to think through, if it's not a crisis, then what is it? And we came with this notion that it's a consequence. And this work has been further developed by Dr. Andreotti as well. But the main distinction here is that a crisis approach tends to frame and assume the current moment is an anomaly, that the system that we're within and our institutions are fundamentally sound. They're just threatened temporarily by external disruptions, which is a different starting point than consequence thinking, or thinking of this moment as a consequence of past choices within the system itself, which sees current disruptions as a reckoning with the limits, contradictions, and deferred costs of that system. And when you have these different starting assumptions, then you also have different senses of what needs to be done. So if it's a crisis moment and it's a temporary disruption, then what we need to do is repair, reform, and restore what has been lost in this otherwise sound system to return to normal or business as usual. And that's very different than the task of thinking of this moment as a consequence of the limits of the system itself, which says, okay, we actually need to learn to live responsibly in the wake of the destruction that this system has created as this system sort of unravels. So that's also something that shapes the way we think about and respond to AI. So if it's a crisis moment, then what we need to do is regulate, resist, or harness AI to survive this disruption. You'll see that actually covers a range of perspectives on AI, but all of those perspectives tend to assume that this is a crisis moment, whether you're sort of quote unquote pro or anti-AI. If you think about this moment as a consequence, then we see that yes, AI can and often is amplifying structural harms, but those harms were long predating the current moment. And there's a possibility that AI could accompany us in relating, knowing, and being otherwise. So what gets foreclosed in crisis thinking is often a question of whether normal or business as usual was ever sustainable or equitable and therefore ever desirable. And what gets foreclosed in consequence thinking can be the possibility of concrete action. What is our task if it's not to restore and repair the system? So we have to think about discernment about what's actually possible, but that doesn't mean sitting back and letting it all unfold either. There are kinds of agency that are available within both of these frames, but they look different and have different assumptions. So one of the things that I want to make visible is that sometimes our critiques of AI, especially if they're within the crisis framing, sort of invisibilize the precursors of the harms that AI is enacting. And I think this post is really instructive in that sense. It's sort of like a little poem about that articulates the harms of AI. And that's not, and these are real harms, right? So by using Gen AI, I accept that my models were trained on stolen data. I accept that the data was labeled by exploited workers. I accept the environmental costs of the data centers. I accept I'm outsourcing some of my skills. I accept that these companies don't have a viable business model. So we might not agree with every single one of these, but we might also see that there's a lot of truth to sort of the critiques that are contained within them. And this post says, if this is new to you, you haven't been doing your due diligence about AI. But what is sort of invisibilized in this framing is the fact that these harms were happening way before that, right? As I noted at the beginning in my land acknowledgement, so much of the knowledge held in our institutions is a product of stolen data. So much of the wealth of our institutions is a product of exploited workers. So much environmental destruction is caused both directly and indirectly by our institutions and sort of the industrial economy that they tend to reproduce. So these are not new harms, which doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say, oh, well. It actually means that we go even deeper into the inquiry to see where did this start. And if this is a much deeper, longer problem and we're facing a moment of consequence, then how does that shape how we respond to AI instead of only, putting the viable choice of refusing or resisting, which is a viable choice, of course. But there's other possibilities, in particular if we widen this frame. So with all of that, I'm going to invite you to do a bit of a bus check-in. How is your bus at this point in the recording? And you can think about what the different passengers are saying, thinking, and feeling. But if it's easier, you can just do a simple check-in, which is my bus okay overall? Is it processing? Or is it burning? And if it's burning, or if one passenger is burning, by all means, take a break, go outside, see if there's a way to sort of release, metabolize what is burning so that you don't repress it just in order to move on. But if you're okay or processing, then we can proceed with the next dimension of the talk. So next up is sort of an unpacking of 3 different layers of AI inequality and unsustainability. And these are the first layer of the inquiry, sort of how is AI being mobilized to stabilize and extend existing structures of inequality and unsustainability? And not just in an abstract sense in this particular moment where many of our systems and institutions do seem to be very unstable and unraveling. And sort of the question is, how are different actors sort of taking up AI, both institutional actors and individuals, to stabilize this system, and in the process often extending those structures of inequality and unsustainability. And this is the dominant trajectory of mainstream, especially corporate AI, no doubt. The second layer is a question of, well, how is AI's arrival actually being lived and contested and negotiated in practice in our institutions, in universities, in schools, hospitals, governments? There's a lot of ambivalence, both sort of collectively, right, let's say in our departments, but also within the individual. And what does that look and feel like, and how might we engage in more generative ways around it? And then the third piece is the possibilities of AI that seem often foreclosed by this dominant trajectory, but are nonetheless still there, and at least for some people worth staying with and looking into. So under what conditions might AI participate in relational repair and realignment of humans with the conditions for planetary flourishing? Essentially, what conditions could AI support other possibilities than those that have been afforded by our dominant system that is now in a moment of consequence or crisis, depending on who you ask. So this is sort of efforts to relate to AI otherwise in design, development, deployment, and governance. So now what I'm going to do is just unpack each of these layers briefly and think about some of the questions that could orient an inquiry about each of the layers. So In the first layer, it's really, again, this question of how is AI being used and mobilized to stabilize and extend existing structures of inequality and unsustainability. So we have it being used by the military in autonomous decisions about who and where to bomb. It's being used in mass surveillance by corporations as well as by states. It is enacting various forms of labor violence through the conditions of data workers, often in the global south, but also through the systemic elimination of jobs, or the threat of elimination of jobs of being replaced by AI. There's the data and extraction and colonialism dimension, where AI systems have extracted languages, knowledges, and cultural data without consent or benefit sharing, which indigenous scholars in particular have drawn a lot of attention to. It's also just generally naturalized various forms of domination. So the data that the AI systems are trained on tends to favor weird knowledge. So that's knowledge from Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic nations. And the responses it gives tend to assume that knowledge system is the ideal, the objective, the norm, and not just in the content of what is shared, but also the framing, the reasoning, the ontology that underlies it. It also, concentrates corporate power in a very few number of AI companies, and in general sort of facilitates the deepening of techno-oligarchy or fascism or feudalism, however you want to sort of characterize it. And then there is, of course, the ecological cost of AI, both in terms of training the models, and then the inference, or the sort of the inquiries that we make of AI systems in these large data centers. And then this is a dimension in terms of GDP that is not as often discussed in terms of ecological costs, but it is extremely concerning for me. I recently heard an interview, I think Jack Clark of Anthropic, who was talking about how he sees the economic impact of AI. And he says, well, I expect AI to sort of grow the economy at levels of up to 10 or more % of GDP growth. And he was, of course, saying this as a positive. But what he wasn't accounting for, of course, is the ecological costs of that much economic growth on the world, on a planet that's already in dire straits. So the questions that we might ask in layer 2 are things like, again, how is AI being mobilized to stabilize these systems and institutions, and looking at this in particular context. So for instance, in our universities or in our political systems. How might our responses to AI shift if we treated it as an accelerant of inequality and sustainability, not the root cause? It doesn't mean we would stop critiquing, but would the frame reorient? When does AI make the violence of existing systems more visible? And when does it actually make that violence easier to ignore? And how can we critique these very real harms of mainstream, especially corporate, profit-oriented AI, without foreclosing the other possible iterations of AI, in particular those that are being developed by systemically marginalized communities who say, we don't want AI done to us. We want to design systems that actually align with our values and support our self-determination and our sovereignty. And that's a very different kind of AI than the AI being developed by the major corporations. So how do we critique mainstream AI without then invalidating these other alternative efforts? So the second layer is about how AI's arrival is being contested and negotiated in practice. And we can see this probably every day in our own institutions and our own lives. And this is about contestation, in communities and institutions, but also even within ourselves and our own buses. And I think students in particular are experiencing this contestation. The younger generation is highly engaged with AI in terms of their actual usage, but they're also some of the most critical people about AI, even when they also use it. So I think there's this internal sort of ambivalence, anxiety about knowing the potential harms that AI is doing to ourselves and to others, also feeling perhaps curious about what it might do, and then sometimes feeling compelled to use it for various reasons, sort of being told that no one will hire you if you don't have quote unquote AI literacy. So how are we sort of making sense of these contradictory responses in ourselves and collectively. So some questions that might orient an inquiry about this is, what does the ambivalence that we feel sort of individually and collectively about AI reveal about the contradictions and limitations that are already present in our institutions and fields? What conditions would make it possible for us to engage with AI reflexively rather than just reactively? How can we responsively attend to the individual complexities and contradictions that shape our responses to AI? So how can we be more conscious of how they're orienting us, how they're orienting those who we work with, and again, hold those 3 C's of curiosity, criticality, and compassion. And then what would relationally accountable engagement with AI look like in institutions, including universities, that are already deeply shaped by inequality and unsustainability? And I know some people would say it's not possible, and others would say it's not likely, but we should try, and others that are sort of already trying to do that work. And we need to make space for all of those positions. So lastly is the question about, pluralizing AI. So under what conditions might AI actually participate in relational repair or realignment of humans with the conditions for planetary flourishing? So not just of human communities, but also with more than human beings. And I have just a sampling of sort of what one might call alternative approaches to AI. So there's Thaura that I mentioned before, Abundant Intelligences also have mentioned before. There's the Inclusive AI Lab, which focuses on the Global South and AI development there. There's the Redistributive Computing Systems Group at Cornell. There's the DARE, so Distributed AI, I forgot what the R is for, but they do great work, both with data workers and also with, I believe, communities whose languages are not sufficiently attended to by dominant AI systems. And then there's, the last example is Matritech, which is a group of women and Two-Spirit leaders who are sort of trying to think through what AI means for Indigenous communities. They're neither sort of pro or anti-AI, they're just trying to make sense of what AI means for these communities. And this is just a sampling. There's many other examples of people trying to do AI differently, understanding that there are significant limitations of what might be possible within the dominant system, but nonetheless trying to think about how we can pluralize who actually gets to design and develop AI and to what ends. So the questions that might orient this layer of the inquiry would be, how can universities actually support communities who've been excluded from AI development to not only critique, but also shape what AI becomes, if they want, right? Not assuming that they do, but if communities would like to do that. How can we pursue alternative approaches to AI without romanticizing those alternatives or ignoring the conditions that make them fragile in the first place? Under what conditions might AI accompany efforts to interrupt and repair extractive relations rather than simply extending them in a new form? And can computational systems be designed in ways that honor relational ontologies? And I think that projects like Abundant Intelligences are deep in that inquiry, and we have a lot to learn from what they have learned. So before I move to wrap up, I wanted to give a brief example of my own inquiry in relation to the layer 3, the AI otherwise, or alternative forms of AI. And it's just a small effort to reframe some of the conversations we have when we think about the ethics of AI. So a lot of conversations about ethical AI are very anthropocentric and also very Eurocentric. They ask, how can AI be aligned with human interests and safety and values and preferences? But what they tend to do is center a particular kind of human without acknowledging it. They're usually centering a Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic idea of what the human is and should be. And we are not attending to the values and preferences and priorities of other human communities. So that's one layer of where harm gets reproduced and where we might need to interrupt. But there's another layer, which is that aligning with humans in general also forecloses our responsibilities to the other than human beings that we share this living planet with and that we depend on. So it presumes that humans are the primary sort of concern in terms of our accountability in AI. If we reframe about Earth alignment or Earth-centered alignment instead of human-centered alignment, we might have a different outcome. So aligning AI and those of us who engage with it with the living planet that we're part of. And this is a framing that is coming both from an article about an Earth alignment principle of AI by Gaffney and others, as well as through conversations that Dr. Vanessa Andreotti and I have had over the past 2 years. So I wanted to give an example of an Earth-aligned approach to higher education and practice. So keep in mind that this is an inactive prototype. It was an effort to see what we could do in terms of reorienting AI in higher education towards Earth alignment. And this was called the University of the Future. And it tries to think about, how can we shift our relationship to knowledge, to each other, but particularly focusing on different disciplines towards sort of more relational intelligence, not just our mastery of specific knowledge and facts, and not efficiency, but actually expanding our capacity to sense, respond, relate, and participate in the living world with more humility, discernment, and care. So you can visit the University of the Future site, but keeping in mind that it is not an active inquiry. It was time-bound. You'll notice that you can still chat with the custom GPTs created for the University of the Future. They are on OpenAI, and one of the reasons that this prototype is no longer active is because of our concerns about OpenAI and its corporate practices. But we also wanted to keep up this prototype as an illustration of an example of how we could imagine and practice AI differently in higher education, but also recognizing the very real constraints on that in terms of the corporate hosting of these bots. So feel free to explore, recognizing that it hasn't been updated in quite a while, and that it was a limited and time-bound experiment. Earth-aligned AI is also something that caused me to notice, that there's a lot of conversations now about green AI, sustainable AI, AI for climate, some of which I'm part of. But noticing that we are talking about this in many different ways and not necessarily sort of parsing the differences in different approaches. So I mapped 3 different visions that people are putting forward about green AI. The first is technical greening, so essentially reducing AI's own ecological footprint. So more energy efficient models, local models, smaller models, task-specific models, more renewable powered data centers, and optimizing hardware. Now the limitations, they each have sort of goals and what they offer and limitations. The limitations being this notion, this Jevons paradox, essentially that when we make systems or technologies more efficient, that tends to extend the overall use, so it doesn't actually decrease the consumption and might even increase it. And overall, it simply doesn't address the underlying extractive systems that AI comes out of and that AI is often being used to accelerate. The second layer is AI for ecological intervention. So using AI to support environmental monitoring, biodiversity tracking, climate modeling, basically optimizing responses to ecological breakdown and technological solutions in many cases. The limitations here, of course, is that this tends to reduce nature to resources and treat living ecosystems and place-based relations as abstract data, not necessarily attending to or accounting for local knowledge and the impact on local peoples. And then the third is sort of a relational reorientation. So green AI as an AI that helps us to rethink our relationships with other humans, with the more than human world, and with AI itself. Refusing extractive design and governance, centering accountability, respecting those who refuse AI, and trying to see if we can redistribute computational power in the service of collective well-being. And the potential limitation being that this can sometimes become sort of abstract and aspirational if we don't attend to the very real material implications that the other two greening approaches are trying to address. Some of the more exciting approaches to green AI are actually those that try and bring more than one of these together. So for instance, working with communities on the front lines of climate change to see if it's possible to support them in adapting to climate change or responding to biodiversity loss using AI support, but centering their knowledge systems and their self-determination in the design, development, and deployment and governance of those systems. So to sort of wrap things up, what I've tried to present today is this notion that AI is arriving into relational dynamics that are already shaped by centuries of domination and extraction. And these dynamics have produced the social and ecological consequences that we now face, and that AI, in many cases, is deepening. What I want to suggest is that how we respond to AI and how we respond to each other in relation to AI can either reproduce these dynamics further, or it could be a part of wider multi-species efforts to interrupt and remake relationships as we try to navigate this era of planetary transitions, not reproducing the mistakes of the past, but rather learning from them and finding new and recovering old ways of knowing, being, and relating that are more life-affirming and more responsible to all the species and all the generations, past, present, and future. So we've got one final bus checkout. I invite you to take a moment to consider, what did you learn by observing your bus today? Perhaps you learned that you actually have way more different perspectives on AI than you might have admitted before. Perhaps you learned that there's something you hadn't thought a lot about and you want to learn more about. And then think about, what is one thing that you're taking with you from this session, and one thing, maybe one assumption, that you're leaving behind. And feel free to take a moment, pause the video to sit with your bus for a little bit to debrief. I want to, as I close, acknowledge all of the many different beings and thinkers that shaped how I'm approaching AI. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list. But of course, abundant intelligence, as I mentioned several times, is a very inspiring research project. There's Dr. Andreatti's work on meta-relationality. There are community partners that I work with, for instance, Mateus Tremembé of the Tremembé de Barra da Mundaú in Brazil, who has been an inquiry partner with me in the possibilities and the risks of AI, in particular for communities on the front lines. Indigenous scholarship, both about AI and not. The scholarship about Earth-friendly computation and the Earth alignment principle. Post-humanist scholarship, as well as science and technology studies. The Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, who again I've worked with for 10 years and has now closed its inquiry, but still shapes my thinking. And the many more than human intelligences that also shape my thinking, including some of my engagements with AI itself. So I want to thank you if you've made it this far. Here are again the links to the op-ed about 3 different visions of green AI, an article about AI for climate that might be oriented by relational accountability instead of the search for technological solutions, an article that is focused on AI's role in education and how we might reorient both AI and education toward planetary flourishing instead of the flourishing of a few select individuals. The Staying with the Trouble of AI in Higher Education resource, which again is in draft form and your feedback is very welcome. And then finally, the mailing list, if you would like to remain informed about how this inquiry is evolving and perhaps getting involved and learning about upcoming events such as the conversation speaker series that will be launched in fall 2026. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you.